Mr Speaker.
Honourable Member for Bath.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to rise this afternoon and speak on the matter before us. The motion that was moved by the Premier that the House refer the production of Cabinet documents report to Parliament tabled on the 8th of August 2023 to the House of Assembly Standing Orders Committee for further consideration, including consideration of the use of an independent arbiter in disputed matters. Further, the motion asks that the House note that the government will give further consideration to mechanisms that seek to improve, and I like that, the government will seek to give further consideration to things that will improve accountability and transparency relating to Cabinet decisions. 5th of September 2023. Now, in the moments that I have to start my contribution before lunch, I pose the question, you know, why is it that we find ourselves in this situation? How is it that the Parliament of Tasmania have got themselves in a situation that, kicking and screaming, this government have finally maybe realised that they have to actually work across the Parliament to ensure that not only this Parliament but the people of Tasmania can in fact trust the things that this government is doing. And in these minutes, I remind this place and people listening and the people of Tasmania that we find ourselves in this situation because two members of the government left the government benches, moved to the cross benches, specifically to do with two matters that have caused this motion to be moved by the Premier. The two matters that in particular those members, Mr Tucker and Mrs Alexander, raised were concerns about transparency around the Macquarie Point Stadium deal and about Marinus. Now, we have seen over recent weeks the extraordinary circumstances where this government have attempted to push back and not face the realities that this Parliament are expecting of them, that they think they can continue to behave in a way that they have got used to over the almost 10 years that they've been in government, that they don't need to be accountable, that they don't need to be transparent, that they don't need to stand up to the decisions that they're making for any scrutiny. Well, that time has passed, and it will, on the contributions of this motion, be noted by many people in this place that the moment has passed. We all get that. We all know that. But does this government? That's the question that remains outstanding today. In terms of my understanding of this place and the history of just this government but also the Parliament, there can't have been many more times as obvious and as startling as a moment where you lose two members of your government, that two members leave, and they don't leave quietly, they don't leave under agreement, they don't leave in a way that they feel like they have got comfort in what's going forward to them. They leave in an extraordinary way, stating very clearly what their expectations are and stating very clearly what they understand has been agreed with this government, and yet moments after this happened, the government, who you would think would be absolutely on alert, would absolutely be high alert to the expectations of the people around them, backtracked almost immediately. Now, not on the specifics of the Macquarie Point Stadium deal, not on the specifics of Marinus, but in terms of interpretations, misunderstandings perhaps, not by anybody, not by the two members that have left, that, like myself, haven't necessarily been in this Parliament for a very long time, but seemingly by the Premier himself, a misunderstanding of the basics of the processes that he had negotiated with those members on how those matters would come forward. Now, that's incredible. It's incredible that someone with so much history and so much supposed understanding of those processes was negotiate and agree to a deal with two people that they didn't, no members of that agreement that were party to that actually understood. And it caused this place to have to go through and clarify that and bring to the attention of those people that there was a misunderstanding of how those instruments worked. To me, to my mind, to a government says that on the earlier discussion today, say that we've got everything under control and we're doing well.
Member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was on my feet just prior to lunch and reflecting on the reason why we find ourselves here today. Why is it that we have a motion before the House put forward no other than the Premier of Tasmania in regards to this process? And what I was reflecting on was the circumstance that have led us to this point. And reading a number of materials in preparing for today, it seems that there's a consistent theme in the commentary leading up to this conversation that everyone's in agreement. Had it not been that this government were plunged into minority, that two members of the government moved to the crossbench, we would never be in this situation. This government have attempted for almost 10 years to hide behind the reality of their behaviours, to hide behind the fact that they think they can say one thing and do another, or in fact often say one thing and not do anything, which is potentially worse, or say things without being able to back them up, say things expecting that they're not going to have scrutiny, say things and believe that they'll never have to be called to account on it. Well, times have changed, and the time now is that there is an expectation that anything that comes out of the mouths of this government is in fact true, because we know on so many occasions that's not the case. We expect now in this place, and Tasmanians have always expected, that anything this government say that they are going to do, that they intend to do it, and, as I often say, which is questionable, they actually have the capacity to do it, because we know time on time again this government make promises to the community, they don't deliver, they broke those promises, and it's the community of Tasmania that carry that burden. And there will be no burden bigger or potentially more heavy than the burden of the stadium proposed at Macquarie Point. And we question the weight of this responsibility that this government seeks to transfer to Tasmanians, to tax-paying Tasmanians, to members of the community who right now are so anxious and concerned and for many overwhelmed with the pressures of the increasing costs of living, and yet this government believe in their budgetary circumstances that they can just keep piling on that pressure to Tasmanians. Now, we had this extraordinary moment in Parliament this morning during question time, and I think actually it was a surprise to our side of the House. Last week in question time, the Minister for Sports and Stadia, I'm not sure if I've got that title right, I'm sorry, was asked a question about the capacity of the ground at Macquarie Point to carry the development of the Macquarie Stadium. And as we have come to expect, and many of us actually applaud Minister Street, he rose to his feet and he said, I don't have that information or advice on me, but I'll get it to you as soon as I can. And that is something that you can respect that. You can respect it.
Actually, not what I said, but okay. I said I hadn't received the advice.
That's right, but you would bring it back when you did.
No, I didn't.
You actually, there were calls from this side of the House saying, would you do it by the end of the day? But you ignored that because one of the behaviours, now that the Minister has chimed in, I was being kind to the Minister, but one of the behaviours of this Minister is to lower people into a false sense of security of actually being genuine in this place, and then when it hits the rubber, when it actually gets tough, ignores, heads down, keeps speaking and just ignores the interjections, takes them when it suits him but not when it doesn't. So I remember the interjections that said, will you bring it back in that sitting day? And he didn't even say yes or no, he just kept talking. You just got to talk through these things. So my memory of that moment was a question was asked, there was no answer to be provided, but he made a commitment to come back. And so this morning we asked again, Minister, are you aware of the circumstances, the capacity of that ground to carry the weight and scale of this development? And of course, anything is possible in any environment, but it comes at a cost. So the engineering solutions that might be required to deliver the stadium that this government is so obsessed with could actually come with significant costs, if at all engineeringly possible. Now, having been put on notice that the question was asked, he had a week to come back and actually have that information in front of him. If he was doing his job, he would go and ask for that. Oh my goodness, this question's been asked. Could this be true? Is it possible that we cannot actually deliver this stadium on this site? But when the question was asked today, and Hansard will reflect, the Minister went nowhere near the question. The Minister was asked a number of things. Will there still be a roof on the stadium? Nowhere near that. Is it physically possible to put it in an engineering sense on this site? Nowhere near it. How far down under the natural level of the earth there? Because we know there's all sorts of fill, all sorts of interesting things in that place, and we know that there actually isn't, for majority of that site, solid ground under, rock and other things under, because it's actually reclaimed land. We know that the original area where the land met the water is a long way back under where this fill land is. So we asked that question, nowhere near that. There was a question about whether, does the roof remain? Nowhere near that. Now, this minister is someone that we believe is genuine in his ability and his willingness and commitment to do the right thing by Tasmanians and give good answers in this place. But today he wasn't able to do that. And the question is why? Why are you not able to characteristically and genuinely respond to those questions when they're put in front of you? Now, most people, when they assess and interpret that type of behaviour, said something to hide. Most people interpret that as saying you don't want to go near the answer because you know the response is not going to be palatable. And so what happened this morning? There was an attempt to say, oh, this is all Labor's fault and Labor's got it all wrong and you'll just wait for the process that Labor supported in this place to ensure that there was open scrutiny of this government about this project, which was brought around because of the actions of the former members of the government that left government under absolute feelings. I won't speak for the feelings that they had, but my observation of their feelings was complete frustration with the fact that they were sidelined, that they were dismissed, that their concerns that they have said that they raised, to the point where one of the members actually revealed publicly that he had indicated his intention to resign as early as March, that they just kept getting dismissed. And what they were seeking to do was ensure that this government acted in a way that was transparent and in a way that was credible. And without being comforted with that, they chose the extraordinary action to leave the government and to join the crossbench. Now, when months after that moment, this government, whether it be the Premier, whether it be the Treasurer, whether it be the Minister for Sport or Stadia, can't answer these simple questions and they push it off again, kick the can down the road again, that again is a classic behaviour of this government. Nothing to see here, there's not a problem, it'll all be okay. Well, I'm not sure that it will be all okay. And what's interesting is where this government continue to say that $715 million, we've got it at sweet, despite the fact that all sorts of other infrastructure projects in this state alone are doubling, tripling and not being able to be delivered. How on earth does this government believe, and what fools do they think they're taking this place and Tasmanians to be, that they can actually deliver the stadium that they're talking about on this site for $715 million? Now, I remember as I was driving down to Hobart earlier this week, an interview with the Treasurer. And in fact, my memory serves me, where the Treasurer said, and you know what, it might even be less. Well, we recently had the interim PAC report come down, and that in fact has confirmation that at least $1 billion. Now, you can't have these two competing items in the public and actually feel like you're going to maintain credibility in the minds of Tasmanian people. We know that school projects, other projects around Tasmania in the current market in terms of delivery are going over budget. And many people talk about, and I am completely, I got to the point of being unable to believe this government and the Premier in the deal that they struck with the AFL that committed them to deliver this stadium. So we know in the environment, and this government knows in the environment, the Treasurer knows, the Premier knows, the Minister for Sport and Stadia knows, that costs are going up. And that's on projects where they may have had months, many months, usually, but years often, of pre-work. Work where there's an idea, you consult it in the community, you come up with a concept, you go and get some designs, you figure out the engineering, you get the specifications, and then you get it costed. And you have a sense of what the costs will be. But what did this government do? They had a former Premier announce pretty much without any pre-warning the commitment of a stadium in a State of the State address. And as we revealed through right to information, a small not even a hefty paragraph of scratchings that we refer to like being on the back of an envelope, which actually outlined what the costings might be. What could it be like? But not with all of the other elements that would be expected to be considered within a project, just the actual project alone. And people need to remember that that was for the floating stadium around the corner. That wasn't actually for this stadium that's being proposed on Macquarie Point. And what was curious, and you always know you're in for a bumpy ride when the costings for one project at one site with one type of design, and then miraculously just around the corner another project with another design, the costings are the same, because at that time it was $750 million. It'll cost $750 million, and then, around the corner, it's going to cost $750 million again. But there was no consideration then for the ancillary works that would need to be done on site, whether that be the roads, whether that be the wharf infrastructure, whether it be any other transport support to the area, whether it be the housing that are committed. We already know that this government has paid extraordinary amounts of money to stop a company delivering housing that they had already made a commitment to, or whether it be the provision of car parking. Now, there was some sort of suggestion that maybe that could go underground. Well, I'd like this government to actually describe to the people of Tasmania what the underground of that site actually looks like. Have you actually done the work? We gave notice to the Minister for Sport and Stadia to actually go and bring that to his attention. What is the underground? What do the layers of the underground look like? How challenging will it be to do that work? And not only how capable is the site, but what about the contamination? What about the treatment plants that's there? What about all of those costs? And as it came to the point after the Premier signed a deal with the AFL, a deal that I don't think anyone else in this place would have signed, a deal that not only or not even himself could bring to share with anybody else because he knew it was such a bad deal for Tasmania, didn't go through Cabinet, didn't get Treasury advice, didn't get legal advice, but seemingly was continued to be negotiated poorly right up until the last moment, committing Tasmanians to almost the entire cost and all of the cost overruns and all of the penalties in the deal. There's no one else, I don't think, in this place or commercially minded that would have signed a deal like that. And then we know that Tasmanians are almost fully responsible for that cost, whatever it ends up being if this government continue on this obsession. The AFL have been very clever in capping their contribution, $15 million, to the capital costs of this project, capping it and rendering Tasmania and Tasmanians responsible for the balance of that. And we know that the Treasurer forgot to ask for the federal contributions to be exempt from future GST transfers. We know that the initial contributions from the federal government recognised the work of a precinct. Sometimes this government actually present this story in the community in a way that they talk about an item, a stadium with a roof, maybe not with a roof, a stadium that's capable of being built, maybe not without significant engineering works, but there's not always that mention of the fact that there's all these other costs that will need to be delivered within the precinct. We know that there's tensions between Tasports and the government in terms of land and whether actually this stadium can fit. So you talk about whether what's the certainty of the ground, and then you talk about the scale. And you talk about the bulk of this development. Can it actually fit? You know, there's talk now about roads being closed, and there's concern from the RSL about the impact and it being impeded on of the Cenotaph, one of the most special places in Tasmania for so many Tasmanians and their families. It seems to me that the work we're doing this afternoon and the debate that's happening this afternoon about the production of documents it's far too late to be doing this work because it should have been done earlier, because there are questions around a whole lot of projects for this government. But in reading something to prepare for today, I read that people knew that in the past the government wouldn't have an appetite for this work, that they would try and block any attempt to do this work. But what we know is now this work has to happen. I mean, again, yes, this is the motion of the Premier, but often the things that this government do are as a result of relentless pressure from Labor bringing to their attention the flaws in their behaviours and their actions. And there was a motion on the books, 138, moved by Tasmanian Labor, a motion by our leader, Miss White, that actually sought to have this process conducted and provide independence, something for the approval of the Speaker, in terms of having it independently looked at. But the government went into a process and delivered a report that they reviewed it and did it themselves. And then you've got to sort of say, well, you know, how do you trust that process? In reading that document, there were some things that were of particular interest to me. It was important that this document reinforced. As we know, there's a member about to go to privileges, there's a Premier under pressure, there's a Treasurer that... and I heard someone say this the other day, so I'm not actually going to take credit for it, but as is the chaos on the other side, there's a Treasurer, if he could find a bus, he'd throw the Premier under it willingly. There's a Sports Minister who uncharacteristically is standing and not actually behaving in a way he usually does. That's just got to build alarm bells. Like the AFL document that was released that was redacted so heavily, alarm bells. When you redact something, it says, well, what are they hiding? What's not in there? What do they not want Tasmanians to know? And that's what this process and this motion is about. But the government must remember that as a government, as an executive, ministers take individual responsibility, but there's also a collective responsibility when someone over there does something and it's not right, or they don't respond to an order, or they don't provide the information that they've been asked, or they don't answer a question. Collectively, they need to hold themselves accountable for their individual behaviours, but collectively we need to hold them together on behalf of the people of Tasmania. One of the other things that's interesting in this document, because, and I've said this before, many times when I'm reading documents like this, I'm doing it for the first time, so many times I'm reminded of things that are important, and seeing it in a document for the first time. And I hear people talk all the time about the fact that people within government, whether it be relationships between government and departments, or relationships between portfolios, or tensions or relationships between ministers, or between, say, the Premier and the Deputy Premier, that these days there's been an erosion of one of the most important principles in our world, which is the ability to give frank and fearless advice. And I think, and it was interesting reading it, because it was an interesting description of that a defining feature of the Westminster system is the freedom of public servants to give frank and fearless advice. Ministers are not obliged to accept that advice, but they are expected to take it seriously. And what I think's been happening in this government is that people have stopped listening to the frank and fearless advice, stopped asking for it, stopped putting themselves in a situation where they're receiving it. And that's that's the beginning of the end. I think I was in a meeting just yesterday, and people were talking about the fact that when people have been in positions for a certain period of time, they lose perspective and connection to reality, and they lose that circle of people around them that they can rely on to give them frank and fearless advice. And it seems to me that if the Premier had sought that in the process of tying Tasmania into the AFL deal that he did, then we wouldn't be in this situation. We wouldn't be going through these motions in the Parliament this afternoon. Because what's actually happened and what we're actually dealing with the outcome of here is that not that long ago there was tripartite support in this place for Tassie to get its AFL team and its AFLW team. And that was what was front and mind for Tasmanians after such a long period of time. And Tasmanian Labor repeat our support for an AFL team and an AFLW team. But what happened through this process of this government believing that they no longer had to hold accountability, that they no longer had to be transparent, that they no longer put themselves in situations where they were receiving frank and fearless advice, we've got this deal signed that gives all the risk and all the responsibility and the financial burden to Tasmanians. Now, there's really close timeframes not too far into the future that this government have to meet. And my question is, you know, how far down the path will it be before we find ourselves already in a situation where we're not being able to meet those expectations and the financial burdens are already being loaded, extra burdens are being loaded on Tasmanians? And how far down the process will it be uncovered the realities of all of the aspects of this project? Not just the realities around cost, not just the realities about responsibility, but the ultimate reality of glossy brochures or glossy comments that somewhere say, oh, there'll be a convention centre included and it'll be for, you know, thousands of people. But actually the documentation doesn't say that. And that's again one of the things that I really concern myself with this government, that, and through question time again this morning, people stand up, the government stand up and represent situations and represent things as facts that they just know not to be true. But once they've said it once, and this government, and I have to say, are masters of the deceptive repetition, that this government stand up and say the same thing that they know not to be true. And so it becomes a conversation in the community where then the community go, well, it must be right, they're our government, we should trust them. But the purposes of this conversation and this motion before the Parliament this afternoon is to say, question mark, do we trust them? Is this government, and again, I'm not going to take credit for this, it's something that one of my other colleagues has said, but is this government in fact, of all the things that it's best at, the most secretive of all governments that Tasmania has ever seen? Is this the least accountable government, the least transparent government that has ever led the people of Tasmania? What we know is, and Tasmanian Labor's efforts to support the process of the projects of state significance is, it will unravel and unwind and uncover all of the things that this government have been saying about this project. We already know not to be true, but it puts it out front and centre for the Tasmanian people to assess and then to be able to make decisions about what they think of. And I've spent a lot of time this afternoon talking about the Macquarie Point Stadium project, but actually this process is also true as an example of the Marinus Link project, whether it be the North West transmission lines or whether it be the Battery of the Nation project. I remember not that long ago, ministers ordered to provide documents, not providing those documents and thinking they can just get away with it. But again, this Parliament has demonstrated its strength and demonstrated its expectations. It's the same with, and I think this is probably, I often when I talk in the community say to people, I love what I do, I've never enjoyed what I do more. But then sometimes when something is laughable, I have to say at the same time, but it's so serious. And so this morning in question time, you have people responding to questions with answers that are just so far from the truth that it's laughable. And the people that are doing it are laughing on their faces. And it's like, it doesn't make any sense that when a government is so far in debt, when a government is operating in deficit, when a government, the NAB report came out yesterday, or 2 days ago, when there are reports that factually represent what's happening in the economy of Tasmania, that this government go, oh, that's Labor talking the place down. No, it's Labor talking fact, something that we and the Tasmanian people expect the government to do. But when business confidence is softening, when the environment of this state is shrinking, the economy of the state is shrinking, and the government say, no, that's not true. I mean, one of the backbenchers this morning stood and gave this whole string of things that weren't quite right on the mark, and when people would stand up and actually give the factual responses, they say, you know, oh, Labor are so negative. What the Tasmanian people need, and this is what I want to really reinforce in my contribution this afternoon, what the Tasmanian people need is a government that says, this is the truth. We're not going to kick the can down the road on things anymore. We're not going to hide from the realities. We're going to actually accept that things are hard, things are tough. We are going to connect with and understand the people of Tasmania that are doing things so hard right now. It was unbelievable to me today that the government would defend a decision to have funds for the people of Tasmania So this is to support with power bills, and to say, you know what, we're going to hold half back. So Tasmanians are hurting now. Tasmanians are under pressure now. We have got evidence and examples of businesses that are finding it hard to either grow and employ more people or keep the people that they've got going. We know just this morning we were reminded of 300 people that lost their jobs at Tas Networks. In this environment, to lose your job in the rising cost of living pressures is a horrendous burden for people in our community. But this government had the opportunity to provide financial support to Tasmanians, and they held back half of it. I'm going to finish by saying that I know the Premier of Tasmania takes on, because of his own passion and connection, the portfolio of mental health. But for me to see this morning the Premier, the Minister for Mental Health, wearing an Are You OK badge and defending the decision of this government to hold back financial support from the people in Tasmania who need it the most, just is another demonstration of we want a government we can trust. We have to go through this process to determine the production of cabinet documents and how that works, because we're not trusting or seeing a transparent and accountable government.
Speaker.